And we're dealing with 2 Kings 1 through 13. This is week 28. We're just zipping along here. I think these stories are probably some of the most well-known stories of the Bible that we'll be talking about. And so I thought we'd deal with some of the more obscure stuff today. Topics for tonight: Baal-zebub. Should be very familiar to you because it shows up in the New Testament in a different form. Elijah and his fascination with fire. Retribution for the follically impaired. That's a great story. Does sacrificing really work? That's an obscure story. Why did Naaman ask for dirt? And Elisha as a type of Christ. Plus anything else you guys would like to talk about. So to start with, you may or may not remember this story where the king falls through the lattice in the upper chamber of his house. This is the king of Israel, and he's hurt. And so he sends messengers out. And he wants to know whether or not he's going to recover. And so he says, go inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron. But meanwhile, the Lord has a different idea, and he talks to Elijah, the Tishbite, and he says, go and meet these messengers and say, you know, there's a God in Israel and there's a prophet here, and why are you going to Ekron? And so he gives them the message to take back, and the message is you're going to die. And so they go back and tell the king this, and the king says, who told you this? And they said, well, we don't know who it was, but he was a hairy guy. And so right away, they knew it was the prophet Elijah, the hairy Tishbite.
At some point during his reign, King Ahaziah fell out of a window injuring himself. He was confined to bed, and rather than inquire of the Lord, Ahaziah sent messengers to inquire of the god of Ekron to see if he would recover. The Lord sent his prophet Elijah to confront the messengers and give them God's message for King Ahaziah. He would never recover from his injuries, and he would die in his bed. Baal-zebub appears to mean Lord of the Flies, and in the New Testament, Baal-zebub or Beelzebub is demoted from pagan deity to demon. A plausible scholarly proposal is that the original name of Beelzebub, Baal the prince, and that the final consonant was changed by the Hebrew writers in order to make it a term of criticism. That's from the Hebrew Bible.
And so basically you see that term, or at least the first time I remember that term was reading it in the New Testament, and they're talking about a devil, but it actually stems from this god of Ekron. And the whole idea behind it was that he was a god that the king wanted to talk to, because obviously Elijah never told him the things that he wanted to hear. So then he would go to other gods. And I think we're a little bit like that sometimes. When we know the answer and we don't want to hear it, we tend to go other places to get a different answer, as if that's going to change anything. In 2 Kings chapter 1, as a result of this whole deal, the king's upset. And so he sends a captain of 50 to go get Elijah and bring him in and talk to him. And what happens to these guys?
They die.
They die. Lightning strike from heaven comes down, wipes out all 51 of them. And so the king, being a persistent fellow, he sends another captain of 50. And same result, he dies. It's only until the third captain with his 50 comes, and he does things a little differently. Why doesn't he get struck down?
He obviously knew what had happened to the first two groups, and so he went like on his knees practically to Elijah and basically said, hey, don't kill us.
He really respects Elijah. I don't know if he respects him as much as maybe he fears him, but he realizes that he's a force to be reckoned with. So he approaches the prophet in a different way. And so the Lord tells Elijah, okay, go with him. And then they go and talk to the king. And that's kind of the end of the story. But the moral of the story here really is you need to have a certain amount of respect for the prophet. And that's going to be cemented a little bit more later on. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 2, we have Elijah being translated, and then the mantle goes to Elisha. And before he leaves, Elisha is given kind of an offering by Elijah. Elijah says to him, what can I do for you? And do you remember what he says?
Double spirit.
Yeah, he wants double his spirit. Now, a lot of the people have thought that what this meant was he wanted to be twice as spiritual as Elijah. And of course, you can't gift somebody spirituality in that way. It doesn't work. The writers or the translators kind of felt the same way. And the way they present it is that they have Elijah, they chronicle 7 of his miracles. But for Elisha, they chronicle 14 of his miracles. And some of the miracles are very similar. And so obviously they thought that that's what it meant. But if you look at the cross reference, which I showed on our Sunday broadcast, it goes back to the birthright. And in this sense, I think what Elisha is trying to say is, I want to be the prophet. Elijah says, are you sure? Be careful what you ask for. It's kind of saying, like, I want to be the bishop. Who in their right mind would want to do that? Who would want to be the prophet? Elijah says, okay, if such and such happens, then that's what will occur. Then Elisha goes on, and it's interesting because he retraces the same steps that Elijah went in going to the point where he goes to the Jordan River and then he is lifted up in his chariot of fire. And that's the exact same course, or in reverse, that was done by Joshua when he entered the promised land and they conquered Canaan. There's a real symbolism here of Elijah and Elisha corresponding to Moses and to Joshua, because they go to the same places and they're recognized in the same way. Okay, and then Elisha also heals the waters around Jericho, because the area around Jericho was cursed ever since the time when the walls came down. And it's really interesting because the way that he heals the water, does anybody know the story? How does he heal the water?
Doesn't he take his cloak there and he throws it on the water, and then the water separates so that they can walk across on dry land?
Yeah, that's another one. Another thing that happens, Elijah does the same thing going in, is taken up. He gets the mantle and then he uses it to cross the water. But I'm talking about a well that's nearby that's bitter. And that whole area has really bitter water. And it's kind of interesting because Elijah asked for a measure of salt. And then he pours the salt into the well and heals the well with salt. And people are like, whoa, that's weird. But salt is very symbolic in both the Old and the New Testament. Anybody want to guess about the symbolism of salt?
Well, it's all about the Savior.
Yeah, the Savior uses salt a lot. What's it symbolize, or what does it mean, or what does it have reference to? Well, salt is a preserving item, and it's also symbolic of the covenant. You remember that when people came and did sacrifices, several of the types of sacrifices they did required that they bring salt.
Not only that, but it is a healing agent.
Yep, it's a cleansing, healing agent. Very good. I'm going to talk a little bit about Elijah being translated.
Now there was a reason for the translation of Elijah. Men are not preserved in that manner unless there is a reason for it. Moses was likewise taken up, though the scriptures say that the Lord buried him upon the mountain. Of course, the writer of that wrote according to his understanding. But Moses, like Elijah, was taken up without tasting death, because he had a mission to perform. They had to have tangible bodies. The Lord preserved Moses so that he could come at the proper time and restore his keys on the heads of Peter, James, and John, who stood at the head of the dispensation of the meridian of time. He reserved Elijah from death, that he might also come and bestow his keys upon the heads of Peter, James, and John, and prepare them for their ministry.
Why was Elijah reserved? What keys did he hold? What keys did he bestow upon Peter, James, and John? Exactly the same keys that he bestowed upon the head of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. And what were they? Some of you may say the keys of baptism for the dead. No, it was not just that. Some of you may be thinking that it was the keys of the salvation of the dead. No, it was not just that. That was only a portion of it. The keys that Elijah held were the keys of the everlasting priesthood, the keys of the sealing power which the Lord gave unto him. And that is what he came and bestowed upon the heads of Peter, James, and John. And that is what he gave to the prophet Joseph Smith. And that included a ministry of sealing for the living as well as the dead. And it is not confined to the living, and it's not confined to the dead, but includes them both. That from Joseph Fielding Smith. So this whole idea of Elijah and his sealing power is very, very important. And the idea that Elijah has to come, else the whole world would be cursed, is in all four of our canonized scriptures. And so this is a very, very important point. Any thoughts on that before I move on?
I have a few thoughts. I think it's wrong to compare prophet to prophet, but Elijah is much spoken of by the Latter-day Saints, but Elisha is not. We know the Bible is correct as far as it's translated, and some of the events in Elisha's life were like, you're going to speak about them, about the fact that he was follically challenged, shall I say.
He wasn't hairy like Elijah, let's say that.
Right. Elijah, we hit, for me, the main significance are his miracles. He doesn't preach about the Savior much, as we learn in the lesson. Not his preachings, but his miracles are. So I think there is much more to be known about Elisha, and we will perhaps only know that on the other side of the veil. But some of the stories are head scratchers for me, and I don't feel comfortable about them. But we read the Bible with open hearts and open minds, and we don't accept, well, I don't accept everything literally. Are you horrified? You have to have an open mind about the scribes and the writing of the Bible.
No, I appreciate you saying that. And in some ways, I think we all kind of feel like that. Let's talk about one of these horrific stories. What is this one? Steve, you might as well continue because you brought it up.
On a plain reading, these young men were mocking him because he was bald. So he called upon two, was it she-bears, to come and...
He actually just curses them, but the Lord sends two she-bears.
Right, that's a strange story. There's probably much more to it. There may be an embellishment, I don't know. I'm not heretical here, but yeah.
Let's just talk about it a little bit. Number one, the area that he was in was the center of this Canaanite practice of worshiping false gods. In the Bible, it says children, but it's not. Translation is for their rebellious youth are mocking him. And the mocking has to do more with the fact that he's not divinely called like Elijah was. He's not hairy like Elijah was. He's not divinely called like Elijah was. And the number 42 is kind of interesting because, as you know, in the Old Testament, numbers have meanings, and 42 means death. And so it's interesting that this would happen because it's the Lord protecting the sanctity of his prophets.
Retribution for the follically impaired. The bears did not kill and eat. The large carnage is mentioned as an indication that their behavior was not natural. This story, like the Elijah story in 1:9-16, emphasizes that the man of God must be treated with proper respect. The Jewish Study Bible on page 730, Robert Alter shares an alternative view of this bit from Elisha's life. This murderous response to the boy's mockery is morally scandalous. It is meant to suggest that Elisha does not make responsible use of his prophetic powers, that after turning death to life at the spring, he now spreads death. The early rabbis were so outraged by this story that they felt constrained to assert it never really happened. Their formulation, neither bears nor forest, became idiomatic in Hebrew for a cock and bull story.
So that was kind of interesting. And so there's an idiomatic expression in Hebrew that refers to this story because they don't really believe it happened. But our angle on this is that the people were growing up in a disrespectful society, in a society that didn't recognize Jehovah or his prophet. And when they mocked his prophet, the Lord took care of it to ensure that they wouldn't do that again.
But it sounds more plausible that way, but I keep an open mind. On first reading, it's like...
It does sound kind of wild and crazy, doesn't it?
What? Yeah.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this war that happens against Moab. As you can see on the map, Moab was a client state of Israel. They paid taxes to Israel, and they gang up on Moab. So Israel, Judah, and Edom all gang up on Moab. And there's a stone that describes Moab winning. Now, in the Bible, what happens is that the three of them cross through the desert to the south. They call on God to help them. He gives them water, and then there's a bit of a battle. But in the end, the three kingdoms lose. And so this stele here is kind of a cross-reference of the king of Moab saying that he was blessed. But how it happens is kind of a little bit unusual and strange. So here's this permanent record from Mesha, who was the king of Moab. And he goes through and describes that he was the king for 30 years and that his gods were Shemesh, and that he saved me from the kings, and that his son then succeeds him. And so you have to kind of wonder what happened there, where initially the three kings were winning. They called on God, God helped them, and then they lose.
Does sacrificing really work? Around the year 850 BCE, almost 100 years after Israel split into the northern and southern kingdoms, King Mesha of Moab rebelled against the north. Moab was one of Israel's eastern neighbors on the other side of the Jordan River and had been under the thumb of the north for about a century. The northern king, Jehoram, understandably couldn't let this go, so he mustered his troops and, along with the help of the king from the southern kingdom, Jehoshaphat, and an unnamed king of nearby Edom, went to put Ness in his place. The outnumbered Moabites were pinned inside a walled city. Out of conventional options, Mesha sacrificed to his god, Chemosh, his firstborn son, on the city wall. To some scholars, this story represents the worldview of the authors of the Hebrew Bible, one that allowed for multiple gods, a view known today as monolatry. In this view, many gods existed, and from the view of the authors of the Kings, they acknowledged these gods while also asserting that Yahweh was their God, and he was preeminent among the many gods that existed.
Okay, thank you. So this guy is pinned into his city. He's surrounded. He sacrifices his son to his God. After the sacrifice, a great wrath came upon Israel, so the Israelite-led coalition withdrew and returned to their own land. And that's how the story ends. Mesha's move, though hardly easy for him, made sense in his world. He appeased his god Shemosh with a sacrifice the deity couldn't refuse. With divine pleasure restored, a wrath fell upon the Israelite-led coalition and they were repelled. The biblical storyteller not only is clearly on board with the idea that Mesha's sacrifice worked, but he didn't even feel the need to explain the concept to his readers. Neither does the writer explain why Jehovah didn't interfere at that point and give the Israelites a glorious victory. The writer accepts without explanation or hesitation that notion that other gods actually exist, can be appeased, and have the power to affect the course of human affairs. At least the Israelites thought so, along with all their ancient neighbors. This is another one of these stories that you read and think, what's going on here? This is an interesting concept from the point of view that even the Israelites at this time, before all the reforms come through, they believed in other gods. The belief was that every region, every section of the world, every piece of dirt had its own god, and that there was a war amongst all of these gods. Can you see how in their mind that would be easy to fall away from the worship of Jehovah by simply moving territories? And that's why the Lord was always very adamant about, you need to worship me.
Yeah, I can also see how because they weren't quite in tune at this point, I can also see how they would have felt like, well, Jehovah was their God and not anybody else's God. I can see that as well.
Oh, so they were very, he's mine,
Yeah.
that's yours, we don't share.
Yeah.
There is no explanation for why all of a sudden all three forces that had the Moabites trapped just left.
So what we're saying is the Hebrews, from what time to what time, believed in other gods?
Yes. It wasn't until the reforms that happened just before Lehi leaves and goes to America that this idea that there is only one God becomes prevalent. There's a reform that goes through the Jewish community based on one of the kings, one of the righteous kings. But yeah, there was a general belief throughout all the world that there was a multiplicity of gods, that each section of earth had its own gods. Now, certain people like Abraham have come to know and come to realize that there's one God, but the general belief was that there were many gods. Just to kind of prove this point a little further, we're going to go deeper into the story. And when you get into Kings 4, 5, 6, and 7, you have Elisha raising the woman's son from the dead. This is very similar to what Elijah did. And then we have Naaman the leper, and I'll talk a little bit more about him. He's a Syrian general who's very famous. And then we have several wars with Syria. And then we have a prophecy from Elisha. I don't know if you remember this story. There's a city that's under siege, and there's a drought, and there's no food. Elisha makes a prophecy that tomorrow you'll be able to get food really, really cheap, and it'll be very abundant, and nobody believes him. And then what happens is in the nighttime, the Syrian army hears something mysterious, like another great army coming, and they fear that the Egyptians are coming to defeat them, and they've been hired by the Israelites, and the Hittites are coming. And so they leave everything and just disappear. And so the next day, some lepers walk out into the Syrian camp because they figure we're going to die anyway. We might as well see if we can get some scraps. And they find the entire Syrian army has left. And so they load up with food and goods, and they go back to town and tell everybody. And then there's a rush out there. And then, in fact, it's exactly what Elisha prophesied. The next day, you can get food really cheap because the entire Syrian army left and didn't take anything with them. They left everything there. Now, let's talk about Naaman. Now, do you remember the story of Naaman?
Well, he has leprosy, and his wife's maid told him that if he went to Elisha, he could be healed.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Anyway, so he goes to him, and Elisha says, go to the river and wash yourself 7 times. And this didn't set well with Naaman. I guess expected something else.
Well, Elijah didn't even come out and meet him. So
That's true.
That took them off.
Yeah.
That was the first thing that was upset. And then he thought he was going to come out and be, a big show and do something dramatic and heal him.
His servant told him, I can't remember exactly what his servant said, but Naaman did go into the water. He did wash himself, and he was healed.
Awesome.
The other thing too, that he was, he figured it would be like maybe just drink this and it'll be fine. But the river that he had to go to was gross and disgusting. And so he wasn't impressed by that either. So he was pretty put out and pretty mad by the end of it all.
Yeah, and he was kind of a high up guy and quite wealthy, and he brought all kinds of money and changes of garments. He brought millions of dollars. One guy that I read this week said it was $1 billion that he brought, the equivalent of today, to pay for this. Of course, the prophet doesn't want anything. Of course, later on, his servant does, and then he gets cursed with leprosy, but for lying. But in any case, the interesting part about this story, 2 things, is that both times the servants kind of step in and rescue them. The first one was the maid, as Sue indicated, who said, it's too bad you're not, down there in Israel, because there's a prophet who could heal you. So she's doing her missionary work. And then it was the servants of Naaman who said, look, if he asked for this huge, big thing, you would have done it. But he didn't. He just asked for something simple. So just do it. I mean, what do you got to lose? And so both times the servants are the ones that are wise enough to understand and see the Lord's hand in this. And so the reason I wanted to go through all that is because Naaman, at the end of this, he's converted. And so he says, this is verse 17, I would like to have 2 mules stacked with dirt from this area, if that would be okay. And everybody's thinking, well, why do you want the dirt? Because he says in verse 18, I've got to go back to Syria. I'm converted. I know that Jehovah is God. And I want to be able to sacrifice to him. So I need some dirt so that I can do that. Because the gods are attached to the earth, right? And so he's saying, I'll take some dirt with me, and then I can continue to sacrifice. Because I'm going to go home, and, I'm a big shot there, and I'm going to be with the king, and he's going to want me to go and sacrifice with him to Rimmon, who is their Syrian god. But he says, I know Jehovah's the God, so I need some dirt to take with me. And so when I read that, I thought, wow, that really does cement that idea that the gods were attached to the earth and that they were very localized. Any thoughts on that or questions before I move on?
I think when we try to liken the scriptures to ourselves, which we should do, when Naaman was told to bathe himself in that river, and 7 times. To the logical mind, that seems, why 7? And why in that river? And I think maybe in our church lives, we're asked to do things. And I know the prophet Joseph Smith used to test the brethren. I've read quite a few examples where the prophet has tested the brethren with requests that didn't seem fair or didn't seem logical. And I think this was maybe a takeaway that I got from it, that when the Lord speaks, then we follow him. If we just follow our own intellectual logic, then we will come up short in the gospel of Jesus Christ, I believe. We have to be humble, and Naaman eventually humbled himself and went for it. I apply that to myself and ourselves.
No, I appreciate your comment. A couple of things that I think of when you said Joseph Smith liked to test the brethren, I remember him, I think it was calling brother and sister Kimball to his house. And then he says he was going to seal Sister Kimball to either himself or somebody else. And that was a test. And then he eventually seals them together for time and all eternity. And the other interesting thing is that I'm sure when Naaman was going down, he dunked himself the first time and he says, no change, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, no change, 5th, 6th, no change. And it wasn't until the 7th time until he was perfectly obedient. And that number 7 is very significant because it means completion or perfection. When he was perfectly obedient, then came the healing. Thanks for that, Steve. Now I want to talk about Elisha as a type of Jesus Christ. And I think Steve said this earlier, that he doesn't really talk very much about the Lord, but his actions do. And you can see that the similarities here are uncanny. He was an enemy to the king. This is Elisha and Jesus Christ. He provides abundant water. He provides abundant oil from a cruse. He brings back the dead to life. He feeds 100 people with a small number of barley cakes. He cures a leper. He finds things that are lost. You remember the axe head that gets dropped into the water, and then he transfers the properties, the floating properties of a piece of wood to the axe head, and it floats. And so all of these things are kind of foreshadowing what Jesus Christ himself would do. Although he didn't necessarily preach with words, he preached with actions. And I think that was very clearly outlined by Steve earlier. Do you remember we talked about this, was it last week or the week before? The defenestration of Jezebel.
She gets thrown out a window.
Yeah. Jehu was the new king and he was cleaning house. And he came and he said, is there anybody up there that's for me? And there were 2 or 3 eunuchs that were there, and he said, toss her out the window. And so they do. Now, the significance of this is interesting because Jezebel had received a prophecy from Elijah. And do you remember what her prophecy was?
She would die. Did he say she was going to die out a window? I remember.
No, it says she would die and that dogs would lick up her blood.
Oh, right.
I believe is how it's termed. And interestingly enough, she lives way past Elijah, way past her husband who dies, and she's getting on in years. And I'm wondering if she's thinking to herself, you know, that prophecy never came true because she was able to outlive all this. And it's kind of the way we sometimes think that the evil people get away with stuff. Interestingly enough, if you go back to the scriptures, Jehu is the he, and Jehu said, throw her down. So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horse, and he trod her underfoot. And when this is kind of gruesome, so I apologize in advance. And when he was coming, he did eat and drink. So after she's dead, he goes in for supper. And then he's sitting there thinking after he's had dinner, go and see now this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter. She is, after all, a daughter of a king, so we should bury her properly. So they go to bury her, and all they can find is her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands, because the dogs came in and did their work. And the reason that I tell you this story, as gruesome as it is because of Hugh Nibley and his talk, Time Vindicates the Prophets. A lot of times people say, you know, those prophecies don't work out. And my understanding is simply this: if you wait long enough, they do. Time vindicates the prophets.